Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to season 2 of the Biome podcast. It's officially the first proper episode, so welcome back. This is the series we're going to be talking about conservation conflicts, and we're starting with a particularly controversial one, trophy hunting.
Yes, I feel like this is a particularly, very divided, one with divided opinions. So what we're really going to try and do, especially in season 2, is just really have a balanced overview of arguments for, arguments against, and then at the end talk a bit about our opinions. But as always, we'd love to hear what you think. So any comments, put them below, and we can have a bit of a discussion about that. So Robi, do you want to maybe talk about the overview, what we're going to do today?
So yes, we're very excited to talk about trophy hunting today. As Emma and Kate have said, it's a very nuanced topic, and because of this, we think it might take us a while to do it justice. We want to go into as much detail as possible. So at the end of it, you can also have your own opinion and you can be confident that it's as balanced as possible. So we are going to do this podcast in 2 sections. Section 1 will be an overview of what is trophy hunting, followed by all the pros, all the arguments for it, and all the cons, why you might not agree with trophy hunting. That'll be the end of part 1, and then we'll come back in part 2, and we will talk about, we'll kind of discuss it, what we think. We'll bring in some evidence from both overseas and at home in the UK, and we'll really try and unpack it and try to form a conclusion. We'll talk about the next steps of how trophy hunting is being dealt with around the world, whether it's been banned, whether it's still happening, and then at the very end of it we will tell you our opinions, what we've thought. This is going to be very exciting because I actually didn't have a really strong opinion on trophy hunting until we sat down to do all this, and when we were researching, it was great just trying, seeing all the evidence and forming your own opinion. So that's going to be the structure. How about Emma? Why don't we start with what is trophy hunting and how does it work? What's the deal? Why are we talking about this?
Yeah, no, I think it's really good to put it into context because I think it was unclear in my head kind of what the difference between trophy hunting and canned hunting was. So just to be clear, we did an episode on canned hunting on a previous Biome podcast. This was where we were talking about basically animals that are reared in captivity. They're often sedated, drugged, and then released into a confined area where they're then shot by a hunter. This is not what we're talking about in this episode. We're going to be trophy hunting is when hunters go out and they stalk wild animals. So it's not captive, this is in the wild. It's a completely legal practice as well. That's also a key point to make. And it's basically when hunters go out, stalk this wild animal, and then they'll take a trophy home. So it could be, for example, the head of a lion, or the sort of the skin and the body of it. You basically take something from the hunt. So that's kind of what we're talking about there. Just to be clear that it's not canned hunting. There's a previous episode on that, but trophy hunting, this is in the wild.
And that was one of the things that kind of not shocked me, but I found really interesting when we were researching this, that it is actually legal under international wildlife legislation. I kind of thought that, all this whole uproar about Cecil the lion, that was trophy hunting when I think it was a dentist called Walter something or other went to Zimbabwe and shot this lion. That was trophy hunting because it was a wild lion, and I thought this was completely illegal, which is why there was this big international uproar. But actually, under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, if they're on Appendix 2, as the lion is, it is legal to engage in trophy hunting. So that's just that's putting it into perspective. That's the kind of behaviour we're going to be talking about over this podcast.
Yeah, and another important point is we're largely talking about the sort of international scale of trophy hunting rather than local, cultural, historic trophy hunting that has occurred in certain communities for thousands of years that's largely sustainable. We're more talking about international foreigners coming in somewhere and shooting something to take back home.
Yeah, and obviously you've probably heard about this topic. It's very, very controversial. Do you want to maybe talk through some of the opinions on this topic, Kate? Kind of what the different divided opinions are?
Yeah, sure. This is a super divisive issue. Public opinion is largely split. Public opinion is largely negative, particularly in Western Europe, in the UK, and large parts of the US. And most people are very anti-trophy hunting. Prince William came out and spoke, bless him, with ITV a few years ago. And Prince William has kind of extensively travelled in Africa and worked in conservation quite famously. And he spoke out in favour of trophy hunting in Africa and basically said that it could be beneficial to conservation. And he was heavily criticised in the press and in the media about this, because people thought, how can you call yourself a conservationist and say that there's ever a case for trophy hunting? Internationally, opinion is also quite split. Kenya, for example, has banned trophy hunting. They did so in 1977. And so they are obviously opposed to trophy hunting, but as we've said, it is legal in a lot of other countries. It's legal in a lot of southern African countries. So there's a bit of disagreement there. Kenya is always cited as an example kind of for and against trophy hunting, because by 2016, wildlife populations had declined by about 68%. And a lot of people draw the correlation between the ban on trophy hunting and the decline in wildlife. But obviously a correlation is not a causation. And Kenyan government are adamant that trophy hunting is not to blame for this decline. And researchers have suggested that it's more to do with human activities and human population growth and encroachment on habitat, stuff like that. So in the scientific community, opinion is also quite divided, but scientists are largely more in favour of trophy hunting, and they have actually warned that global population is being undermined by celebrity power. There was an open letter written by anti-trophy hunters, and they were calling for a ban on trophy hunting in the UK and the US, and this letter featured a lot of famous names, a lot of members of parliament, and just members of the public. But this letter contained a lot of misleading information, which led scientists to kind of talk back at it. In 2019, 133 leading scientists and community representatives wrote a letter in the journal Science, which is a very notoriously and highly regarded scientific journal, and they argued that banning trophy hunting without implementing viable alternatives would be a detriment to biodiversity, and kind of warned against the use of celebrity power in conservation when talking about misleading information.
So that's really interesting. I think, viable alternatives is a point we're probably going to come back to quite a bit throughout this podcast. But now we're going to start to introduce some of the arguments in favour of trophy hunting. And there are quite a few. There were more than I thought there would be when I started researching this. So I'm going to talk to you about two of them, land usage and value to reproduction, which are both kind of, land uses in particular, I wasn't really aware of in regards to this issue. So, and this really did shock me. Currently, more land, and I'm talking about Africa here, in particular East Africa, but currently more land is conserved in Africa under reserves that operate trophy hunting than in national parks.
I think that's shocking. That is very shocking.
Yeah, I was really quite surprised to learn that. And therefore, if you did come out and ban trophy hunting, you would likely lead to a loss of these protected areas, a loss of wildlife habitat, which is obviously one of the key factors in the global biodiversity crisis and the extinction of species. So there is an argument that trophy hunting, keeping it present, keeping it in operating practice, actually conserves more habitat for wildlife than national parks, for instance.
I think this is something we'll probably touch on in another episode when we talk about national parks more, but the reason that more land is conserved on these reserves is because this is privately owned land. And I think sometimes privately owned land is overlooked in conservation because we focus so heavily on national parks. And it also brings in this kind of worry of, if it's privately owned land, can we tell people what they can and cannot do on their land? And also because it's privately owned, they're more likely to trophy hunt because they can operate how they want. So I think it's more that more land is conserved in Africa privately than it is publicly, and that's why there's more trophy hunting.
That's really interesting. Okay, that was fantastic. I didn't know that. So the second point in an argument in favour of trophy hunting is is around the animal's value to reproduction. So a lot of trophy hunting advocates say they would only ever shoot or kill what an animal which would be considered post-reproductive. So either due to its age or illness or infirmity, an animal that isn't going to reproduce further in its life. So they argue that killing them has little to no impact on the larger population. If to reframe it, it would be a little bit like if you were hunting only people over the age of 70, because they're not reproducing anymore, there would arguably be no impact on the population.
I feel like comparing it to humans, that might shock people.
Yeah, maybe that was a bad example to use. But anyway, we move on. So even though it's distasteful from... as someone who loves wildlife and living animals very much, it's quite distasteful to refer to an organism as viable or non-viable for the population, or classifying organisms according to their worth. But it's one of the realities of both conservation and science. So those are the first two kind of arguments in favour of trophy hunting. I feel like they're some of the most common ones, but there are plenty of others, aren't there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think those ones are really important to mention about the land and kind of the viability, because some of these I hadn't thought about until we started doing this podcast. But there's also quite a lot of economic benefits, actually, which is probably, again, one of the main reasons that people say that trophy hunting could be a benefit to conservation, because it's expensive. It kind of varies on the individual, but if you're looking at, say, something like a lion, that's about £20,000 to go and shoot a lion. If you go up to elephants, that can get closer to like the £80,000, £100,000 area. This is a lot of money, like in a single animal. And so some people say that this could just be replaced by something like phototourism or the building of lodges and things like that, where lots of tourists can go there. But kind of like you mentioned with the land comment, Robi, it's a lot of, and Kate as well, with like this land being privately owned, a lot of this isn't in sort of very, how do I put it? The land there isn't conducive to being converted into like a really attractive touristy area. So the amount that is generated by phototourism is always likely to be less than trophy hunting. So just something to have in mind if we're talking about replacements for trophy hunting.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the other thing with phototourism, in terms of the money to replace trophy hunting, you would need so many more tourists. And like you said, that's an issue in terms of having the space. But secondly, everything a phototourist does, a trophy hunter does. So they need food, accommodation, game drives. But a trophy hunter on top of that needs specialised guides, permits, international shipping permits, like so much more is needed, the equipment. So the costs are always going to be a lot higher. And so you can't, in terms of the financial costs of the two, you can't really compare them. They're just not on the same level at all.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you noted that some land isn't actually, not all land is conducive to phototourism, because I think we might be at risk of forgetting that, because we're animal nerds, and if you dump me in the middle of bushveld, I'll have a great time, even if it isn't scenic. But if you're a phototourist, where are you going to go? Right, you're going to go to Okavango, you're going to go to Ngorongoro Crater and Kruger National Park. But these are relatively small areas, and animals range all in between, and the vast majority of it might not be this kind of stunning landscape. It might just be bushveld and scrub forest, which isn't the most kind of alluring for phototourism, but big game hunting and trophy hunting can operate in those areas.
And phototourists want the big five, right? So trophy hunters sometimes do, but if you're trophy hunting an antelope, you don't necessarily want 2 prides of lions in the same space as you. That's terrifying. It's not safe. So they are more likely to go to reserves that don't have the big five, which are less attractive to a lot of international tourists.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think Robi and I have talked about this before in previous podcasts, but basically it's almost as if kind of you need this monetary value on animals for them to then become valuable and kind of worthy. So by having this monetary value on the head of every single animal in a trophy hunting area, that is protecting them. That's protecting them, and that's protecting the land, because the people who own this land want the hunting to continue. So it's also in their favour to massively conserve it. And so just as an example, in the wildlife division in Tanzania makes 60% of its income from trophy hunting licensing fees.
Wow.
So there's a lot of money going into sort of these protected areas, this area of private land, basically, as a result of trophy hunting.
And so obviously economic benefits are one of the most touted benefits of trophy hunting. And there's a trophy hunting organisation called Blackthorne Safaris, which operate in the south of Africa. And I just went onto their website and I looked at what they had to say about the economic impacts of their own work. So I haven't fact checked this, independently, but this is from the website of Blackthorne Safaris. And they have a figure that says in 23 African countries that allow sport hunting, 18,500 tourists pay over $200 million US per year to hunt, which is an incredibly vast sum of money. It's a lot bigger than a lot of aid packages that go to a lot of these regions. And what's nice about that money, if this is true, is that it's not just concentrated in glitzy lodges like Okavango. It theoretically should spread across much larger areas and benefit more people. And they also note that in that same region, 22% more land is protected by private hunting outfits than by national parks. So this coming from people who operate trophy hunting, they seem to take quite a firm line that they are having a positive economic impact on the area itself. So those are just some numbers to throw out there.
No, I think it's interesting when you think about the numbers in the land. Oh my goodness, excuse me. And you think about, how without this trophy hunting, there would be some areas that maybe wouldn't get any income at all. And so maybe just another one to mention is like a pro is population control. So in many areas, this is the case in national parks as well, is numbers of animals, because especially if you have fences and things like that, if they get out of control, the entire sort of trophic cascade can basically go out of balance. If you have too many elephants, for example, that can have quite serious effects on the landscape. So where you need population control anyway, there are usually culls in national parks. Sometimes that's a way to do it. You could also have translocation, but trophy hunting is another way to do that, where you could lower the population and generate income at the same time. So whereas culling, you just have to pay a lot to shoot all those animals, you would actually get money if you control population through trophy hunting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Another couple of pros that I think are often overlooked are the benefits to local communities. So food resources is a really key one. The carcasses of a lot of the animals that are trophy hunted are often used to feed local communities, because often the meat is not what the trophy hunter themselves is after. They're either after the head,
the tusk, or
the skin sometimes, but not the meat, and that would just get thrown away. So in the interest of not wasting meat, it's often used to feed local communities. An example company who does this practice is Tutabi Hunting Safaris, who are mostly targeted towards US clients. And an arm of their business, which is in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, provides 3,400 meals of trophy hunted meat to school children each month. And because of this incorporation of sustainable use into trophy hunting, some people in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa call trophy hunting conservation hunting, which I think is quite an interesting distinction compared to how we see it in the West and in Europe. Another kind of key benefit to local communities is jobs. Namibia is an example of a country that is doing trophy hunting, I think, really well. They actually have a really well-regulated industry, and they have species-specific quotas that are clearly set, which means that only X number of animals of each species can be trophy hunted each year. And basically, because it is a sustainable industry, as their wildlife numbers increase, the sustainable number of animals that can be hunted also increases, because they're working based on species-specific quotas and carrying capacities. So carrying capacity, very briefly, is the kind of maximum number of animals you can have in an area that's beneficial to the ecosystem. So, for example, you wouldn't want to have too many grazers, because then they'd overgraze the land, which can cause knock-on effects like soil erosion. etc. So you kind of, if you have an enclosed space, a national park or a private reserve, you will have a carrying capacity for different species. If that goes over, you're then going to want to lower the number that you have. Trophy hunting is one way to do this, as Emma mentioned. It's a form of population control. And so if you're using trophy hunting as a kind of sustainable way to control your population, you are offering a financial incentive to protect wildlife, because as the numbers go up, the number of trophy hunting goes up, which means more jobs. So it's kind of on that if it pays it stays argument that you guys were just talking about, but this way it's benefiting the local people. And this also means that jobs involved in trophy hunting are also indirectly involved in conservation and land management. And it also encourages people to stay in rural areas and rather than migrate to urban areas, which is often seen in a lot of African countries. It's kind of urban's rural, and that's not necessarily always a good thing. And so having job creation in conservation in rural areas benefits wildlife and local people and encourages them to stay in those rural areas.
That's not something I thought about in terms of keeping people in rural areas, because, yeah, it's a huge loss when you've got all your young people leaving to go to cities, and then these communities are at risk of basically collapsing because they don't have the people to support that. So, yeah, really interesting point.
It's quite interesting, you know, being able to say that as a Westerner, that, you know, rural to urban migration in less developed parts of the world might be a bad thing, especially when it ignores the fact that we did that for the last 200 years during the Industrial Revolution, and we got rid of all our wildlife, and we now live in massive towns. And so, yeah, I always find that those sorts of things they make me feel a bit uncomfortable. But I guess the last kind of point, and again, this is another uncomfortable point, and it's quite a cynical point when it comes to the benefits of trophy hunting. It's kind of a case of the devil you know versus the devil you don't, in that we have trophy hunting now, so we know what's happening, we have a record. It might not be a particularly good record, I don't know, but we do have a record. People are looking into this. But by banning trophy hunting, this doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have less lions killed. It might just mean that there is no control over the hunting of animals and how many animals are killed. Which is, you know, it's very easy to sit here and say killing animals is bad, but at least this time we know who's doing the killing. They're telling us, they're saying, right, we've got this quota, you're giving us a quota, which your scientists came up with, we're doing it here, X, Y, and Z. By banning trophy hunting, you don't get rid of the demand. There will still be a demand for elephant tusk. It won't go away, and you may just, by getting rid of the legal side of it, you may just further embolden and further enlarge the illegal market, the poaching, which all the evidence suggests is a lot harder to manage, a lot worse for wildlife than trophy hunting is. So we hope that has been a thought-provoking summary of all the arguments in favour of trophy hunting. There are a lot more than I ever thought there were, and I think what was interesting is that arguments seem to get more and more persuasive when you bring in the human side of it, which is not something which gets talked about quite so much in kind of social media conservation, you know, the big stuff that goes in the headlines, which is something that's often missed. So yeah, we hope that has given you a bit more of a balanced opinion.
Yeah, I think that last point is really crucial, and there is a lot of argument in favour of keeping things where you can see them. And yeah, I agree. I hope we kind of covered the arguments in favour. We're now going to talk about the arguments against trophy hunting. So, Robi, do you want to kick off with that? Yeah,
I think maybe that's quite a nice parallel. We ended benefits with quite a cynical, harsh benefit, and now we're going to begin arguments in opposition to trophy hunting with the ethical considerations. Is it ethical to kill things? To my point of mind, it's not. I wouldn't kill something. I wouldn't want something to kill me, be it a human or a lion or anyone else I know or any other lions I know. And so the ethicality of this does come into play here. Is it ethical that rich people can travel to less developed countries, pay a load of money to shoot some charismatic wildlife and then leave? It's not really my place to say, I don't think. I think everyone has their own individual ethical compass. Although it is interesting that, in our laws, in our state legislature and local legislature, we've always had laws against murder and we've always had laws against killing people. That said, clearly humanity has a distinction between wildlife and animals because we have a dairy industry and we eat cheeseburgers and all these things like that. So, delving a bit deeper into the ethical side of it, one of the benefits, what we've discussed earlier, is that the carcasses are often given as meat to local communities. On the surface, that could be considered a very good thing, but I've not seen any data, any independent data, that's data that hasn't come from trophy hunters themselves about whether this is actually true in the majority of cases or whether this is a minority of cases that get trumped up in order to support a point. This practice, I did read someone mentioning that this practice might increase the dependence of rural people on bushmeat. It's not something I entirely agree with. I think there is a distinction between being given meat and going out and hunting it yourself. Although this same article makes the point that, okay, you're feeding people. Surely a preferable long-term and sustainable method of feeding someone is investing in crop defences from pest species. We talked about elephants and bees recently. Surely a more sustainable solution to feed people would be digging wells and providing resistant crops, that sort of thing. The other ethical consideration, which personally I don't actually think should factor into this debate so much, in that it's this to hold this opinion is very much a luxury of those who are probably not so involved in the issue on the ground and probably have the distinction of living in a developed and urbanized country where this isn't so much an issue. But trophy hunting, it could be argued, enhances a human-centric view of nature, that natural ecosystems are incapable of self-regulation and must be managed by humans in order to remain healthy, which is A, false, and B, quite a harmful belief, I think, in shaping our own ecological policy. It elevates us to a higher position than a lot of other species, which, I think you could argue for and against that. But I think it's an important comment to make. It's not something I actually am going to consider when I make my final opinion on trophy hunting, but it is an interesting little snippet there. So those are kind of the ethical considerations, which could go either way, I think. But I think some of the much more damning evidence in opposition to trophy hunting comes from the ecological side and the trophic side.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think the ethical side is a big one to consider because I think for the general public, that is what sparks the most outrage. Like, that's what happened with, true. Like Kate was saying with Prince Philip when he spoke out about this. He got absolutely shredded to pieces for presenting the arguments for, because they're like, how can you do this? How can you consider yourself a conservationist if you say it's okay to just kill animals? So I think for the general public, that one is very important. But yeah, like you mentioned with the whole how it affects trophic processes, that is also quite important. So kind of what we mentioned with the idea of only shooting older animals are maybe not viable or not contributing to any population growth. The idea that if we're just killing these sick and infirm animals would have no impact is actually a bit flawed. Because if you think about it, animals will die in ecosystems naturally, and that will actually provide food for a whole host of other species like scavengers, and then their decomposition will then go back into the soils that will help restore nutrients and things like that. It's all cyclical. So if you are then, like you mentioned with the feeding the bushmeat to local communities, yes, that's a positive for the people. But then if you're taking away this natural cycle of life, death, decomposition, regrowth, that also I think could have impacts. I
mean, particularly, if you remember back to our episode on the Indian vulture crisis, vultures depend on dead animals, and it's not really the healthy animals that they eat. It's the old, it's the sick, it's the ones that wander off into the bush and die. And so it's very easy to say, oh yes, these sick and old animals have no role in the ecosystem anymore, but they support a whole guild of scavengers, hyenas and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And also, if you think just about how hunting works, not from a human side, just animals predating on other animals, often, say with lions or basically any carnivore, they will predate upon the sickest or those that are maybe slightly weaker or the oldest. There is an element there of they can't always take the fittest individuals because they are the hardest to catch. So it may actually be that juvenile predators then suffer as a result of this because they are unable to learn how to hunt, because there would then no longer be any weaker individuals that they could prey upon. So I think that's a kind of interesting point to consider there from the trophic side.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And I think another opposition to trophy hunting would, to go from the ethical side to the ecological side and now back to the human side of it, is the sort of manipulation of the industry. And it's really interesting, Kate, I wonder if you know anything a bit more about, you said Namibia are doing it really well at the moment, because for me, a key opposition is, it's very easy to say all this money is going back into conservation, but is it? How do we know that? There's no oversight or legislation on a state level? Maybe there is in Namibia, but from what I understand of the places I've researched, there isn't. And so even, it would seem very easy for all this money to actually... It's very easy to say it's going into conservation, but actually it's very easy to pocket it as well. And I think the prevalence of trophy hunting might just fuel the dominance of the conservation industry, in East Africa in particular, of a relatively small number of rich South Africans, which would prevent local people from engaging in their own economy and their own natural resources in a way that, for instance, becoming a national park ranger might not.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that a lot of proponents of trophy hunting always say, I'm in favour of trophy hunting as long as it is well regulated, money goes back into conservation, and like all these other lovely things. So it's never just, I think trophy hunting's fine. You always have these, a lot of fine print involved that is often undefined. I do agree with that. I think the money going back into conservation side is just funding the costs of running a reserve. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being used to buy a telemetry collar for an elephant or to pay veterinary fees. It could be it's paying the rangers
upkeep of that reserve.
It could be fixing a hole in the fence. It could be paying the cooks staff who work in the lodges. It could be paying cleaners fees who work in lodges, or just other staff who work on the reserve. All that money is still conservation. It's kind of the same as when you donate to a wildlife charity. Not every single penny is going directly to the animal, but the costs of running the organisation, without it, if you didn't have the organisation, you'd be losing the bits of money that do go to the animal. So it is all within conservation. And I think that's the thing, running a reserve is incredibly expensive, especially if you're keeping endangered species. So it is a good, trophy hunting does help support those costs. But I agree that it's often stated as we must do this, but never explained. It's interesting talking about the ecology and the ethics, and Emma, you said about things working in cycles, because I think it's almost, Robi, the point you made about how much people get involved, this kind of human-centric view of the world, and it almost feels a bit like once we're involved, we have to be heavily involved, because then we have to be managing, we're only taking sick, infirm species, but we've got to make sure there's enough left, or if we're taking them all, we've got to feed our scavengers, and it sort of becomes these overly managed systems, or we do nothing. And I think where we're at with conservation at the minute is that we do need these some overly managed systems. We've become so involved in the past that we can't now just back out. But it depends, and I agree with you, Robi, that it shouldn't be the main factor that you consider. But it does sort of seem like there's almost a cycle of management as well as any kind of natural cycle.
It never seems to end, and with the benefit of hindsight, you kind of think, 50 years ago would have been the perfect moment just to pull out. Whereas now, I agree with you. I think we've got to keep going because some animals, that's all there is. They're just in that one reserve, and that's it. And so you've got to, like lions in India in the Gir forest, the northern lion subspecies, which used to range all across North Africa, is now in one tiny population in the Gir forest of Gujarat.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it might be lovely to say, tear down the fences and let's all go home, but
yeah,
that's all there is. And
of,
we're at the stage now with so many species, that's all we have.
It's kind of the classic problem of conservation is the majority of of the kind of biggest wildlife problems like climate change, biodiversity loss, etc. are anthropogenic in cause. Like it's human centered. We are the problem.
Yeah, but it's been a theme for all the podcasts.
But ironically, we are also the solution to a lot of these problems. And so because we've made them, we also have to fix them. And so we have to continue managing these systems. But another kind of more natural, kind of ecologically evolutionary point to make against trophy hunting is that there has been evidence to suggest that trophy hunting may be having evolutionary impacts on species. And people are calling this trophy evolution. So there is potential that trophy hunting is leading to phenotypic evolutionary change. So essentially, as we mentioned at the beginning, often trophy hunting is about the biggest animal with the biggest horns or the biggest tusks or whatever it is. And so it is selective killing. And if you are specifically targeting individuals, you run the risk of changing the phenotype, which is essentially the look of the species. So, for example, if you are exclusively targeting the elephant with the biggest tusks, then you are, over time, potentially saying to the elephants, if you have really big tusks, you're going to die prematurely. So let's grow smaller tusks. Because evolution doesn't realise that it's trophy hunting that's killing them. So this could actually have detrimental impacts to the survival of the species, because if they have evolved to have big tusks for a particular reason, which they probably have, for example, to attract a mate, or to be a dominant individual to spread their genes, then by reversing that change almost, it could have a detrimental impact on the species' survival as a whole. This has been documented with mountain sheep in North America as well, and like various other species. Previous investigations of this have largely been based on statistical analysis and theory. So some ecologists have claimed that trophy hunting is leading to a rapid phenotypic change, but all of this was based on statistical analysis of data with no examination of whether these results are theoretically plausible. So, for example, a study in 2003 by Coltman et al., they used statistical quantitative genetics, everyone's favourite.
What is... You know what? I don't want to know. It's too complicated. Already, it's just... No.
They basically ran statistical tests to see if the selective hunting of Ram Mountain bighorn sheep populations in Canada were being affected by trophy hunting, and they found that they were, and that this was contributing to a decline in horn size over 5 generations. But this was just based on statistical analysis, which basically just means they'd run some models based on genetic data, and they hadn't incorporated in kind of real life parameters, if that makes sense. So another paper, Coulson et al., in the Journal of Wildlife Management in 2018, decided to look at whether, if you incorporate in kind of plausibility, do the results hold true of the pure stats world. So they looked at whether the trophy hunting of bighorn sheep leads to trophy evolution, which they defined as a change in the mean breeding value of a trait. And the trait that they kind of looked at, we're going to talk about, is horn length, horn size. So they basically ran models where they put different hunting scenarios in as a parameter, so they could see how many sheep are being hunted, what size horns they'd have. And they used standard assumptions of quantitative genetics, so kind of standard how evolution would expect to be, and then they added trophy hunting on top of it to see what the difference would be. And they basically found that the fastest rates of phenotypic change attributed to trophy hunting via evolution that are theoretically possible are about 1 to 2 orders of magnitude slower than the fastest rates of phenotypic change reported from the stats. So basically, to sum up all of that, they found that trophy hunting could be causing evolutionary change in the horn size of these sheep, but it's a lot slower than we previously thought. So that's good and bad.
That's really
news,
interesting.
I guess.
I know. I was like, how do you take that? Because I remember I was watching, I think it was like an Attenborough elephant documentary from like 1990s. So not that long ago, but you know, a bit of time ago. And all these big bull elephants came on, and I remember thinking, wow, they're massive, and they, you know, massive tusk. And I remember thinking, you kind of don't see bulls that big anymore. And I guess that's to do with, okay, well, those bulls are probably dead from either natural causes or shooting, and then therefore the modern bulls are a lot younger. But it's interesting that, you know, maybe trophy hunting has that genetic selection that by shooting all the big bulls, you actually decrease the frequency of the genes that code for big size and big tusks, and therefore elephants are going to get smaller and shorter tusked. And I remember thinking, oh god, we really mucked this up, didn't we?
I think that kind of blew my mind, the idea that, yes, I know humans are kind of dominant in every sense of the term, that we're artificially at the top of all food chains, but the fact that we can then shape the evolutionary trajectory of other species is like, wow, okay, we've got a whole new level of influence over the natural world here.
Yeah, definitely.
But in a way, we sort of shouldn't be surprised, because we've been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years. We did it to wolves, and we came up with poodles.
Yeah.
Like that is literally the same genetic pressure. We killed the ones we didn't like, and we made the ones we did like breed, which is essentially what trophy hunting is doing. You kill the ones you want it the other way around. Now they breed, and you know, we got a poodle out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned elephants, because what this study also found was that this evolutionary change would be more rapid if both sexes are selectively targeted. So obviously they were looking at sheep, and only the male of these bighorn sheep have horns. So only the males were being targeted for trophy hunting, whereas with elephants, both males and females are targeted, which could lead to a kind of even faster change. And what's interesting about this is that, as we've kind of said, a lot of trophy hunting happens in private reserves or national parks, but in closed spaces. And it's not the species as a whole, it's that population. So if you're if it's with elephants, and that population over 5 generations evolves to be smaller or pink or whatever it is that happens, obviously they're not going to turn pink, but you know, that's just that population. And then if at any point those fences come down or those elephants are translocated, you've got a slightly different, slightly smaller group of elephants moving in with slightly bigger elephants. Like the ramifications of it, kind of, you could just get lost in it. But it's quite, it's mad. But the big take home is that there's potential for evolutionary change due to trophy hunting, which is something that really should be considered.
So, yeah, obviously, I think that is one of the most interesting points, kind of, for me, the side that you just mentioned, Kate, about, like, the evolutionary changes that could happen. But I guess another con that you've got with trophy hunting is the massive misrepresentation of this industry. And I think why people, particularly the general public, are so confused. Because trophy hunting, or trophy hunters themselves, may market themselves as conservationists. So, which is conflicting for people who, they're taking wild animals, it's arguably not ethical at all, but yet they're advertising it as like, yes, we're very positive conservationists, come and trophy hunt with us and you'll be supporting conservation. And because they are these big, like you mentioned, Robi, with some of the numbers, if they're right, like million dollar industries, they can attract lots of people and continue to secure that funding that they need for these conservation purposes. We've done the pros and the cons. You can judge for yourself whether you think it's going towards conservation. But basically, smaller, maybe local NGOs or individuals that are in countries such as, I don't know, in countries in East Africa, may be unable to attract that overseas funding. So it's kind of like they're the ones getting all the money and all the funding to supposed conservation, but then the little individuals and groups might suffer as a result of that. And also there's the case of some people might genuinely believe that this is benefiting conservation, and therefore they want to support it, they want to be a part of it. But like you mentioned, Robi, I think with the idea that the money could also just be being pocketed, there's very little regulation in a sense of where the money is actually going. So it could end up being basically a massive scam that people are saying all this money is going to conservation, but then it isn't.
And
so,
I guess in terms of sustainable development, from the point of view of the people who actually live in these areas, if you have this domination of one sector of the conservation industry, predominantly by overseas interests who are already quite rich and, you know, well outfitted and stuff, I would worry that you would squeeze out, as you said, not just local NGO people, but actually the engagement of local people with their own economy and with their own resources. I don't know. It feels a little bit too neo-colonial, just from a first glance. Because, okay, great, let's say they are doing great conservation work, and the money is going towards it, and yay, trophy hunting is increasing the number of lions. But say trophy hunting is increasing the number of lions in Zimbabwe, great, but that's being run, I don't know, by a South African or American company, which are very well funded, and, you know, the Zimbabwean people who might actually live there might have very little agency in not only land which is theirs, but also the resources which are theirs, in so much as resources can belong to anyone. And to me, it feels a little bit like, regardless of whether trophy hunting is benefiting conservation or not, it doesn't feel like it actually will benefit the people who actually live in the areas where it's happening to the extent that it should. And it feels a little bit like one of the many shifting faces of colonialism in East Africa. I don't know, which brings in a human aspect, I guess.
I think it's like, I think this is going to be something that we say in probably every episode of this series, is that I think it depends. I think it does vary from country to country, from province to province, community to community. So it's hard to kind of blanket the whole industry across Africa or across the world in one way, because I think there are places where it is really beneficial and there are places where it's completely being manipulated. So it's hard to kind of to say one way or the other. I have to say, with the misrepresentation, the way trophy hunters market themselves as conservationists, I do find quite hard. And I see it on Instagram a lot, with kind of like hashtag wildlife conservation, or, you know, just wildlife conservation accounts that look, on the face of it, you think it's a conservation account, and it's actually a hunter, often a white hunter who's traveling around the world killing wildlife, and they're putting those photos up of them. And, you know, as someone who does understand the arguments in favour of trophy hunting, I'm sort of just like, swallow, breathe, move on, because I don't like I get it, but I don't like seeing it, and I don't like it being them calling themselves a conservationist. I think, yes, they are helping fund the practice of actual conservationists. Those people running the reserves, even guiding the hunts, I would happily call them a conservationist. But the white American man who comes over, I'm just like, oh, I don't really think you're a conservationist. And I don't like seeing it. I don't like these pictures of dead animals, and it's not nice.
I get that all the time with camera trapping, because I follow loads of camera trapping accounts because I love camera trapping. It's a great way to see wildlife without disturbing it. And you think, oh wow, these are some really amazing camera trap footage you get. And then you scroll down and they're posing with a dead kudu, and you're like, oh, you're camera trapping, so you know where to sit with your gun and get it as it comes by. And you're always scrolling through thinking, wow, this is great. And then suddenly, oh, there's a reason you were doing all this.
No, I think it's quite shocking, and maybe just to bring it home a little bit, like we've been talking about this mainly in the context of Africa, which some of you may have been able to visit, but for listeners here in the UK, trophy hunting is also something that happens here, predominantly with stags up in Scotland. So it is a big industry that people will pay significant amounts of money to go and hunt the biggest, largest stags. Again, Kate, bringing back to the point of like, is that driving evolutionary selection in a way? But because they want the trophy of the head with the horns, that is kind of what is sought after. And so it's one of the largest trophy hunting industries in Europe, the stag stuff that's going on in Scotland. And it's millions being paid each year by this whole thing. Again, it's rich people, often British, kind of relatively wealthy, or Middle Eastern kind of people in the oil industry, or Russian oligarchs. Like, it's a very wealthy sport, so to speak. It is not local people who are going out and shooting these stags. And I guess going back to the population comment that we made previously, in Scotland, red deer numbers are at an artificial high that they, like, the highest they've ever been in history. Yet trophy hunting isn't really having any impact on their population. So it goes to show how complicated it is, because you're literally, someone's coming in to shoot one animal, maybe a year. What is that going to do population-wise? There still needs to be supplementary culling in Scotland to kill the hinds and the smaller individuals to control population. Trophy hunting is having no effect on that.
And it's interesting when you mention those stags. I'm sure we've talked about this in another podcast. I'm not quite sure which one it is, but we went into some detail about maybe it was culling in terms of, you know, the deer situation in Scotland, and talking about the money and the amount of jobs that it employs. The Scotland trophy hunting economy, industry, sector, whatever you want to call it, employs remarkably few people. And in comparison, you've got a very... It's an exclusive industry. You've got a very small number of, UAE oil magnates and, as you said, Russian oligarchs, and they come in and they shoot these animals and then they leave. But that actually employs incredibly few people on the ground. I think it was the county of Sutherland we looked at once in a podcast episode. And it was a comparison which George Monbiot did about the number of people employed. And it was tiny. And it just doesn't feel like an acceptable level of public engagement with, well, local engagement with actually their economy. But yeah, that's kind of an overview of the arguments against. There are quite a few, and we've waffled on far too long, as we always do. There is one more kind of case study we'd like to talk to you about today on this part one of the episode, and this is kind of, you could take it both ways, which is why we're really keen to talk about it. And this is the case of rhinos in southern and eastern Africa, which Kate is an expert in. Tell us about rhinos and trophy hunting.
Yeah, so we've gone almost an hour without mentioning rhinos, so it's time to get them in.
Were you getting jittery because we hadn't mentioned the rhinos? Like, must get the rhinos.
No, they are actually a really interesting case study when it comes to trophy hunting. As Robi said, they kind of present both sides of the argument quite nicely. So, in 2019, South Africa won permission at CITES, so the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, to double the number of black rhinos killed as trophies. And they argued in favour of doing this because they said they needed the money to use for conservation. And they also agreed that they would not use the full quota if the rhino population fell below a certain level. So this will kind of appease people. Obviously, rhinos are notoriously endangered. And so people were like, okay, they need money for conservation. They're not going to kill that many. But important to note is that this certain level was never defined, which is automatically problematic. This is a reoccurring issue in conservation, as I'm sure it is in every industry, that if you do not define your quotas and your levels, then they are utterly meaningless. And to say a certain level is, it means absolutely nothing. That could be that we're going to kill 1,000 a year, or it could mean 10 a year. Like, it's just, it has no idea. And it also suggests that this decision was not rooted in science at all, which is concerning. This decision was opposed by some African nations. Kenya and Gabon were strongly opposed to it, arguing that along with poaching, it would just mean that more rhinos are being killed each year. A lot of NGOs opposed. Born Free actually pointed out that South Africa was rarely using its existing quota, so they just said there was no need to up their quota, which I think is quite interesting. it sort of does put a big question mark on why South Africa wanted to up their quota, but I think that's a can of worms that we'll just leave for now. There was support, though, from a lot of other Southern African countries, including Botswana, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and there was international support as well from the EU and Canada. The leader of Traffic's Elephant and Rhino Programme, a man called Tom Myliken, I hope that's right, said that higher quotas could actually increase black rhino numbers and that the selective removal of individuals could benefit the population as a whole. So when black rhinos, a little bit of info on them is that they are solitary animals and the males are territorial. And older males often cause conflicts with other males and prevent them from breeding. So the older male will have his territory that he occupies and he will chase out younger males and prevent them from breeding with the females that live in and around his territory. So Tom Myliken kind of compared this to preventing a barroom brawl. And he said that basically moving these kind of older... what's the word for someone who likes conflict?
Dominant?
Yeah.
Confrontational,
yeah. So he sort of argued that removing these older confrontational males could help get faster reproductive rates going. So it would mean that the younger males were able to breed, which is good for genetic diversity, and it would mean more breeding because it's not just one male, it's multiple males, which means the potential for more cows getting pregnant, more calves being born. Yeah, exactly. The other important point is that he highlighted was that every hunt would cost tens of thousands of dollars, which could be used to fund rhino conservation. Big counter argument, black rhino numbers are incredibly low. There are roughly 5,000 individuals, which is considered a pretty optimistic estimate as well.
That's so few.
Yeah, it's really not many, and it is really important when you're talking about small populations to prevent them getting much smaller, because you then open yourself up to a cycle of small population effects and a population bottleneck where you've just not got enough genes left to have a viable population, and your fitness of the population goes down, which impacts over reproduction again, which again means you have less genes, and it just goes round and round. And so stopping species falling into that vortex is really, really important, and therefore allowing any killing of a population that's already quite low is quite important. And as we've mentioned several times, a lot of these populations are living in isolated pockets where they are separated by fences, and so you're already running risks of these problems. However, the IUCN has said in the past that a well-regulated trophy hunting has brought population increases for both black and white rhino species, which are the two species found in Africa, which has helped reduce larger threats to the species. So, as we've mentioned, it means the habitat that is being supported for the hunting industry protects the rhinos that are living there, and it brings in much needed money. Can't really talk about rhinos without talking about the rhino horn trade. It is currently illegal to trade internationally in rhino horn, but it is legal to trophy hunt a rhino, and your horn can be part of your trophy. So once that horn
seems very flawed.
Yeah, it's yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because once that horn is off that rhino, you can't tell a legal horn from an illegal horn. And the fact that there is a way to legally move rhino horn around sort of muddies the water quite a lot and almost legitimizes the trade. Also, trophy hunting has been used in the past by wildlife trafficking syndicates to supply the trade through hunting permits. So this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, that a legal trophy hunting can be open to manipulation, and that has happened countless times with rhinos and other species that are trafficked, because you can legally shoot your rhino and then illegally sell your horn, because although your horn is legal as part of your trophy, if you then sell it on to someone else as a traditional medicine, that's illegal. So it's...
Because also, in my head with this, is like, it's slightly different from the ivory trade in the fact that a rhino horn does basically stop at the base of the face, whereas the elephant ivory tusk will extend into the face. So it would be possible for the horn just to be cut off, shaved off, and the individual still alive if it were just for the rhino horn trade, whereas if you have the trophy hunting as well, you have to cut off the whole head.
Yeah.
So in my mind, that could also be damaging.
Yeah. So yeah, the rhino horn does go to the bone, but you're right, you can cut it off without cutting the whole horn off. It's literally just like cutting your hair. Or it's more, it's quite comparable to cutting your fingernails rather than ripping your entire nail off your hand.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, exactly.
Oh, that really that made my fingers go all tingly.
Yeah, but you could.
I could really feel that.
You could shoot your rhino, take the head as your trophy, go home, and then just chainsaw the horn off, and then sell the horn, and that would be illegal. But it's hard because you are in legal possession of a horn, and then once you do that, there's no way of tracking it down, and there's no way of saying what's illegal and what's... So it just gets really, really confusing, and it sort of undermines the arguments against rhino horn trade and kind of legitimizes this trade and supports the trade, because you could just contribute to the trade.
The rhino case study goes both ways,
Go
every
back
way.
and forth.
I mean, what do we do with these rhinos?
Well, the other thing with rhinos is they are one of the most expensive animals to keep because of the anti-poaching costs associated with them, because they are poached so extensively and they are in such high demand that you need pretty much 24-hour protection. So you need 24-hour patrols and electric fences at pretty much a minimum. That's really expensive. And so the idea that you could shoot your old infertile male and raise £10,000 is appealing. I can see why you would want to do that. I do think a really important element of trophy hunting that rhinos showcase really well, at least for me, is that they are a species that can really benefit from trophy hunting without being hunted themselves. And so
how does that work?
Well, I think reserves that keep rhinos but offer trophy hunting of other species, for example, antelope species like impalas or kudus that aren't endangered, they could get all that money from those hunted antelope, which they could use to fund their anti-poaching costs for their rhino. So they don't kill their rhinos, but they allow for the trophy hunting industry to support rhino conservation. And I think that's quite an important distinction, that you could be in favour of trophy hunting of some species and not others, and you can kind of use rhinos, you can use trophy hunting to aid the protection of endangered species without killing them themselves.
That's a really nice part. I'd kind of assumed that if you were for trophy hunting, you kind of had to be for trophy hunting of any species. But actually, yeah, when you think about it, that's not the case. And I quite like that idea of targeting one which isn't at risk to benefit another. So we should probably end part 1 of this episode here, because we have waffled on for so long, because I think with trophy hunting it's such an in-depth, it's such a complicated issue. We really want to provide a nice balance to it. So we hope we've done that. We've provided you with all the information you need to sit and buzz about trophy hunting all day and ruminate on your opinions. In part 2 we will return and we will talk about some of the caveats to some of the information we've given you. We will give a really kind of in-depth discussion of each of our points, and we will discuss the next steps for what is going to happen with this sector, and we will come to a conclusion with our own 3 viewpoints on trophy hunting. So watch out for the next episode.
So yeah, thanks for listening to part 1. If you want to check out more updates, more information about what we're doing, all our information is now on the website. So that's biome-project.co.uk. We're going to put the link below as well. And also, if you want to check us out on Instagram, we also raise awareness and post conservation stuff. So I'm Emma Hodson Wildlife, Robi's Robi Watkinson Wildlife, and Kate is... What are you, Kate?
Yeah, I am conservation_Kate.
Okay, so yeah, stay tuned for part 2.